So, before I say anything else about the film, I would just have to say, visually and auditorily, absolutely stunning. So that if there was no narrative whatsoever, absolutely absent any narrative whatsoever, just to watch the film is a thing of rare beauty, and to hear the film, the score and the editing and the visual images, just absolutely stunning. So thank you for that to begin with.
And the cinematographer, Paul Sanderson, is here.
That's, congratulations. Just really, really remarkable.
Thank you.
So then we'll get to the next question, which I think is important. Not a lot of stories about death get a sequel. So
A second act.
a second act.
We don't get that.
So here we have part two.
Right.
So explain that.
Well, I always
Keep the
envisioned
microphone
it.
up.
I always envisioned the full Monty and shot it that way. And there were so many perspectives on death that I wanted to include in this film. I wanted people to find their own story within I think total there are 18 perspectives in part one and part two. I thought it was very important, and obviously it's not comprehensive. These are a range of people who've been shocked into mortality and have different narratives that have sustained them, that don't. But I wanted to cover the important ones that I really heard over 2 years of pre-interviews with several hundred people, several hundred at least, and out of that, these became the important narratives of art, of love, of science, of nature. And there were Buddhism, Christianity, and people kept coming back to them time and time again. So I thought it was important that full range was expressed. So part one gave you a very important part of it, and so did part two.
Well, I think it is true that it is good to have the second act, because there are countless perspectives to look at. And I think I saw in The Alternative Mortician somebody from the first one, right?
Yes, and you saw the novelist James Tracy
Yes.
was saying, I don't want to live another 100 years, but another 14.
That'll work.
Yeah. We brought back a number of the people in the exchange of,
Yes.
would you like to live longer?
Right, and it's good to have that reflection back to the first one,
Good.
so
Yeah.
that definitely helped to tie it together. And there were some other moments. The story of the woman who said it's going to be my time, and now it's not going to work. It reminded me of Little Big Man.
Let's get some pizza.
Yeah, let's get some pizza. And Little Big Man, when he says, well, I'm going to die tonight, and we're going to go out, and he wakes up the next morning, he says, well, sometimes the magic works, and sometimes it doesn't. So, but it was just so beautiful. So to break it down in the big piece of this film, it seems like the first third to a half, we're looking at people that are going to defy death.
Yes,
Okay,
the
so
first
there's science, there's whatever it's going to take, transhumanism. We're going to get past this. It ain't happening.
It ain't happening.
No. So and then the other 2/3 are
But
okay.
meanwhile, we continue to die.
Meanwhile,
let's get our narrative.
it's happening now.
Yes.
So maybe it's not going to happen, but maybe it is. And we who are, and even one of the ones who said, I said 14 years ago, well, it's not going to happen. No. But 14 years goes by, and there's life. So it's not going to happen. It's going to happen to me.
Yeah.
So, and that's what the next 2/3 of the film are about. It's about accepting it's going to happen, and here's how we deal with it. I think it perfect to end it up with the Buddhism, because that's the most sort of accepting no birth, no death, in the moment, what it is. And that seems to be, and it was, I think, in the last film too, that we come to a point where it's about how we live now is the most important thing about dealing with death. So,
how we live now consciously.
consciously.
We're not just passing through the days.
Keep the microphone up.
We're not just passing through the days, but inhabiting them.
Right.
Just with a shaped narrative of what is of ultimate value, whether it is the art you're creating, the deep connected love that you're having, or the science you're creating and in the pushback against gives such meaning to people's lives, and a whole range, but to be conscious about it.
Yes, and people who have struggled with their faith, where we're looking at the higher power, we're looking at the divinity, we're looking at the faith that says what happens, and how can we believe in that when the evidence is to the contrary, and faith being the first step on a stairway we can't see the top of, so that comes in. I sense that time and again certain things came back. We talk about, I think it was one of them in transhumanism, and they were talking about ego, the great I am, which is like, okay, it's going to happen to everybody else, but they'll make an exception for me.
Right. The Williams-Orion quote always gets a laugh.
Yeah.
It really does.
But because it's so true.
Because it's so true.
And that's key to a lot of the film here, because in certain cases you see these are very personal stories. So the question is, okay, that's their story, but does it resonate for me? How does that, and that's why you have to get so many viewpoints, which I thought was really, really good.
And viewpoints specifically from people, and this is the real divide, is people for whom death is visceral, whether it's their diagnosis or a friend who just died. You really cross into a territory that is beyond abstraction, beyond what Saroyan is talking about, which is, I know it happens and I am aware of it. It's the human condition. But the difference between experiencing it, directly through the death of a child or your own death or a bad diagnosis, everyone who's entered that territory, that landscape, says it's like no other. And even if they're in remission, they say, I will never be the same. No. I am conscious now in a way, sometimes in a way that's frightening, and they'd rather not be there, but they have crossed into totally different territory.
And to your point of living consciously, living very aware of the finality of death and to be embracing it. And as you say, and as comes clear in the film many times, it is the diagnosis of oneself, it is the passing of someone close to you, and it does change your perspective. And time and again, as we get older and we become less bulletproof, because as the Buddhist at the end was saying, he was in a place of, I embrace death. I can take a bigger risk, because my addictions are my own way of dying. I'm just going to accept that. And I want to self-destruct, but now I don't anymore. And kids that go out and do the riskiest things in the world, it's because they're bulletproof. They can't die. That's not going to happen. And yet as we get older and people around us die, we start to say, okay, so what do we do about this? But the idea, there's a little bit of an issue while there's this consciousness going on of there's a certain luxury in the beginning of the film of the people that are accepting, that they are deeply conscious, but they are in circumstances which allow them to be able to deal with this in a way that has more meaning, and that's why.
They have the gift of time and money as well.
And resources, yeah.
Well, but Sandy didn't have many resources.
Exactly.
Absolutely. That was it was a $40,000 inheritance that changed her life.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so good that came at the end of the film. I think it's just, I'm going to the structure of the thing here.
Yes, yes.
Because having it end with the Buddhism and having it end with Sandy just before Sandy's just before the Buddhism, and then the death of his sponsor, which is, how does someone who doesn't necessarily have he had the resources to get to assisted living, but they were running out of money and so forth, and he was dying in a way that was not comfortable, not good, and there was that discussion of that, where unlike someone like Tira Lodog had to sort of face up to the real difficulty of it.
Well, I think he was actually having a good time because he was surrounded by his pals, and
that's it.
Don't you agree?
Yeah.
Which grew out of the Nuclear story, which is being surrounded by community, having the ones you love, the ones that are important to you, and you're important to. So the question is, what's the third film? Are we going to lick this thing or not?
Not going to link it. But actually, I am talking about a project with Kris.
And you will not be surprised at this subject.
Of taking the Economist obituaries that my partner Kent introduced me to. And we've spoken to the Economist, and these are extraordinary sort of, they're the back page of The Economist. They're written beautifully. They're about people you ache that you didn't know. Extraordinary, ordinary people, and extraordinary people whom you thought you knew and then you realized you didn't. In that page, all those questions about, what is the narrative and what is a meaningful life are so encapsulated in these extraordinary portraits. And I just began thinking, what a waste. There's so much wisdom in these lives. So why not? So The Economist has gotten quite interested, and perhaps that will happen. And Kris said she would join me.
Yes.
Right.
Well, and how do you do that? Do you go to how those obituaries are written, or do you go to specific
I don't know
obituaries?
yet. We're just sort of at the very beginning, but they will be the foundation. Those obituaries will be. But
It makes sense, though, because it's the same thing. You learn from those obituaries what a life well lived is, what was meaningful to those people, what gave them meaning, and that gives us a chance to try and resonate for us. And it's the same way as in this film.
or how a life wasn't, well
Right.
lived, because they're covered as well. I mean, I think one of the big surprises I was telling Kris about was one quite famous person. Was it Jonathan Miller? He is sort of a great director. He's a opera director, a theater director, but he was also started out as a doctor, and a small country doctor, and he was part of that Dudley Moore, that little group. What were they called? That fabulous group from Oxford or Cambridge. They were very funny. But
Beyond the Fringe.
Right?
The Fringe, yeah.
So he, at the end of this extraordinary life, he said, "I took the wrong turning. This stuff came so easily to me, but a meaningful life would have been. I look back on it now." A country doctor. And how fascinating that is, he had a great life, but those reflections to look at a life that we would think is so eminently satisfying to the person living it, he had a sense of failure throughout all that. And those are interesting sort of insights that we can all sort of take something from.
But that takes us back to not only what we didn't do, we want to not die having not done the things we wanted to do, that we didn't make time for, but it also goes to the idea of miss the boat of living each moment as importantly as it can be. Because if you do that, if you're celebrating each moment, then it doesn't matter whether you took the wrong turn or the right turn, it's you did.
Yes. I find it very sad to think that he did this and looked back on the full life and then thought, I did it wrong.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that's so sad.
And that's where living in each moment, and which the diagnosis gives you, a bad diagnosis gives you, and the death of another gives you, which is make the most of every single moment. Whether it's a wrong turn or a right turn, you better make the most of it because it's all you're getting, in this particular go-round, as far as we know.
It's hard.
As far as we know.
As far as we know, as to run a low dog.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. Now, I want to give the audience a chance to ask questions if they have a chance. Right up here.
Helen, have you considered doing those types of movies in a different society? I'm thinking of places like Indonesia, Egypt, where I'm from, Africa, where the perspective is very, very different. Where I come from, Egypt, people are extremely fatalistic, and when the time comes, the way they accept death is surprising to me. And their life has not necessarily been extremely happy or successful, and yet they are happy, they're ready to meet God. Have you thought about the differences between what we have in our country here and between other nations and other societies?
Well, once COVID is over and the travel restrictions, I definitely would. But it's interesting. I spoke to a number of Muslims just in the pre-interviews, and I think one of the big surprises for me in this film after 200, 300 pre-interviews was how, irrespective of whether it's Jews, Christians, and in some cases many Muslims, religious certainty wasn't really there at the end. It really wasn't there at the end. And I think one of the most startling things I learned making the 9/11 film is that I was privileged to hear virtually all, because the police had most of them, the last-minute phone calls that came in. People saved on their phones, and they were from everybody in that building. They really were. And the word God came up very rarely, very rarely. There was a few incredibly moving last words of someone were saying, pray for me, let's get out the 23rd Psalm, please pray with me until the line goes dead, because then he dies. But there was, from such a wide range of goodbye phone calls as the night was coming, as the flames were coming. It was friendship, it was love, it was tell X, it was a great, and there were many different cultures being represented. Talk about death, not an abstraction, in the 9/11. Those people were all calling from the burning buildings. And I was struck by that as well. I really was. And there were a lot of firm believers that were calling to say goodbye.
I think that goes to the fact that's mentioned in the film by a couple of people, but also in conversations that I've had with people, is what lives on is the love that was there, that stays in the hearts of the other people, and I think that's the thing that from my experience, that people want to live on, is that love, is that connection, and so it doesn't surprise me that those would be the things in the phone calls, rather than God, who we may be speaking to shortly, we may not be, but while I'm here, the people that are also here, I want them to know my connection.
But there were people speaking alone. No one was there. They were just leaving messages. And I was struck by that. And that was, Gabriel Byrne has the last quote that Kris put, as she elegantly created, helped collaborate with me and create so much of this film. The last voice in that voice view was Gabriel Byrne.
Doubting Thomas's.
Yeah, Gabriel Byrne saying at the end, he was an ex-Catholic, he was a firm Catholic, said, in the end, we're all doubting Thomases. It's a great leveler. Anyway.
Yeah, it definitely does. I also, having been in the room when my mother died, that's, again, the resonance of the film, of the sense of something there.
It's a sense of something.
In that silence, that sense of something there, which was not only Buddhist, but it was just an observed sort of fact for them.
Actually, the guys said, Chodo and Koshin said that is not a Buddhist belief, but that they came to that through their hospice work, that it just was a realization outside, and they had to accept it even though they're Zen Buddhists.
It was an observed reality.
Yeah.
Very different from the Tibetan Buddhists.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Who can chart where they're going to be 4.5 seconds the minute they die, and then 8 seconds later they know exactly where they're going to be. The Zen are so different. They really are.
That's fantastic. I think we can take one more question if we have one. Anybody? Right. Okay, right there.
I love that last section. Was amazing. It's like a symphony of voices and quotes, and I'm just really curious about how did you pull that all together? And it also sounds like there were many voices that were not from the interviews.
No, yeah, they were all over the place. Some from part one, and obviously so much of this is my magnificent editor, Kris.
Thank you. But it was very collaborative.
Very collaborative. But every question that I had, it was such a delight. I thought, now I can ask them all. And you're going to have to listen to them. And so it really, that was, it's like I've been waiting my whole film career to just put all those questions in that have no answers.
And we wanted to weigh it, positive questioning. You don't have to know, and so they sort of they seem to be going in a direction of, oh yes, it's faith, it's faith, it's faith. It's like no, there's nothing. And then you back again, with ending with the doubting Thomas. That when it really comes down to it, you don't know.
You don't know.
No, we don't get to know. But thank you so much for giving us a peek into what we don't know. And, what nobody knows. So, good luck with it. And Paul, cinematographer, please. Such a fabulous film. So good.